Hi, everybody. Hi, I'm Vivek, as I mentioned before, but just a little bit of context about this particular presentation. We're going to be covering communication and remote teams. So we're going to talk a little bit about my background, which I gave right now, and then a little bit of a definition about remote teams in general. And then we'll also talk about the different types of remote teams, because a lot of people tend to think of remote teams as the single monolithic thing, but there's a lot of different classes of remote teams. Then we're going to talk about the different types of remote communication styles. So we hear a lot of discourse about asynchronous versus synchronous communication, but what exactly does that mean? And a frank assessment about which communication style we should actually use. What is the best? Is it async? Is it sync? And basically from there, we'll start to drill down into each specific remote team structure. What are the challenges and what are the potential solutions for tackling those challenges? So we'll start with co-located teams with a few people remote. The second is satellite offices. The third is fully remote teams with a high degree of time zone overlap. And lastly, we'll talk about what I find to be one of the most challenging is fully remote teams with a low degree of time zone overlap. And we'll also, briefly talk about why manager support is so critical for any of these tactics that I'm about to describe, and some closing thoughts, and of course a shameless plug for my product. So, so we'll start off with all of that. So first, background. As I mentioned to Ksenia right now, sold a company around 2 years ago, started working remotely, absolutely loved it, but there are essentially two big challenges. First is communication. How do you best contact teammates? You lose a lot of that transparency of communication when you move from an in-office environment to a remote environment. So how do you quickly communicate with somebody? How do you most effectively communicate them without disrupting them? The second is loneliness. How do you actually build genuine bonds with your teammates? And this is something that's so taken for granted when you're working in a remote, when an in-office team. Like the bonds that you make with your coworkers are forged over the small things, like having lunch with them, just bantering about at the water cooler. These things build a sense of camaraderie. So how do you replicate that online to the best of your ability? So, and just to give a little bit of background as to how we kind of came up with these insights. So essentially through the process of searching for our idea in the remote space, we've interviewed anywhere from 50 to 70 remote teams to basically understand their communication dynamics best. And what resulted from that was Pragli, which we consider as a virtual office for remote teams. So that's a little bit of background about Pragli itself. And a little bit about definitions of remote teams, although it might seem a little bit obvious, but it's good to be a little bit precise about this. So essentially a remote team is a team where one or more teammates spends a significant amount of time away from the company office, if there is a company office at all. And one thing to clear up with respect to misunderstandings about remote teams is that most companies are actually remote, even if they don't necessarily advertise it or think of themselves as remote. So the things that we normally ask is, do you have a flexible work from home policy? That would be a valid criteria for actually considering yourself a company that has to think about remote policies in order to effectively enhance their communication structures. So that's something that's super important to keep in mind. Flexible work policies, of course, people who are working actually remotely, fully distributed structures, which actually, even though they're the most common in the sort of narrative that happens on social media right now, are actually probably the smaller subsection of the entire population of remote teams out there. So that's a little bit of a definition. So let's actually drill into the different types of remote teams. And there are a bunch of different categories here, but I've roughly bucketed them into 4 different types. Number 1, hybrid teams with only a couple remote workers. And 2, hybrid teams with a satellite office. And it could be multiple satellite offices. There'll be one HQ where most of the people worked, and then they decided to capture a different market or different talent and decided to open us up secondary satellite offices. That's number 2. So number 3 is fully distributed teams with no HQ with a high degree of time zone overlap. So everybody is in the US, or like there's people in the US and Mexico or Colombia, or Japan, India, Singapore, teams which inherently have a high degree of time zone overlap, and 4, remote teams with a low degree of time zone overlap. So if I'm communicating with a lot of people in India and I'm here in San Francisco. And each category is important to understand, has a different set of communication requirements. A lot of them overlap, but they need to be thought of as separate entities. Okay, so those are the types of remote teams. So, but before we dive into each of the sort of challenges and tactics of each one, let's quickly take and also, yeah, here's a little bit of a visual, how you can kind of think about each of these different types of remote teams. So, you know, on the x-axis, we have this idea of remoteness, right? To what degree is that particular team fully remote? Also on the y-axis, we have this idea of, like, you know, time zone closeness. How much overlap is there with respect to time zones for each of these different types of teams? But now let's quickly, before we dive into those different types of teams, talk about different types of communication styles. So many of you have probably heard about these 2 different types of styles, but I think it's important to really clarify them. The first being, you know, synchronous communication, and the second being asynchronous communication. So let's drill down into that first one of synchronous communication. So synchronous communication happens with an expectation of immediate response. So there's no assumption around what media type you're using. So the media type and synchronous communication are separate. So any communication that happens with expectation of immediate response is synchronous communication. So it can either be chat or it can either be video. And there's a lot of examples of both and a lot of use cases for both. And some common examples of synchronous chat-based applications are, you know, of course, Slack, GChat, Microsoft Teams. If you DM somebody inside of Slack and there's an expectation of synchronous response or immediate response, that's a synchronous communication form. And we'll also get into this a little bit later with asynchronous, but a lot of those chat structures, depending on how you actually institute policies inside of your organization, can also be considered asynchronous. But and with respect to audio and video, Zoom, Hangouts, and, you know, our own product Pragli are synchronous communication tools. Like when you're, you know, discoursing with somebody over video conference, the expectation is that they're going to immediately respond when you have a question for them. So that's a little bit about asynchronous communication. And with respect to the advantages and disadvantages, the advantages, you get an immediate response. If I hit up, you know, Doug, who's my co-founder, with a direct message, if he sees that, he's likely to respond quickly. And another big advantage about synchronous is the higher fidelity of conversation. So the time to resolution is much lower because I can have this really fast back and forth with Doug and get to a resolution quickly. The disadvantage, though, is that when you're doing a synchronous conversation, whether it's over video or conversation, it's really hard to search that information because oftentimes the structure of that information isn't easily searchable. So conversations are hard to search. And the flip side of getting an immediate response is that you're also expected to give an immediate response. So there's a tremendous amount of opportunity for potential disruption. And we'll talk about tactics for sort of getting the best of synchronous communication and also blending it with protocols and policies that allow you to be disrupted the least. And also something to know about synchronous communication is that it's not time zone friendly. So if you don't have a lot of overlap with your other teammates, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to actually use synchronous communication effectively. So that's a little bit about synchronous communication. So let's actually get into asynchronous communication. So asynchronous communication, in the same way as synchronous communication, has nothing to do with the media type. And this is what we have to clarify a lot. Asynchronous comms does not necessarily mean chat or does not necessarily mean video. Asynchronous communication means that the expectation is for a triaged or convenient response. If I get an email, there's no, oftentimes at least, there's not an expectation that it's immediately responded to. It can be triaged to a later point. So common examples of chat-based asynchronous communication is email, Jira, and Asana. And the reason I added in Slack in here is because even though many people would consider Slack to be a synchronous communication tool, for a lot of organizations, they've set up Slack in a certain way where they remove things like notifications or have policies against using direct messages, things which expect where people are expected to give an immediate response, and it sort of becomes this way of sort of triaging responses to a later point. So it's all about the way and method that you think about communication with respect to chat. So that's one thing about chat. And some examples of audio and video communication in terms of asynchronous is also, a product like Loom, which is essentially QuickTime, cloud-based QuickTime. So you can easily create, videos that are recorded with your screen. They can either be screen shares or just a video of you speaking about something, and you can easily send them to your team. Stand-Uply, it's a asynchronous video tool for engaging in stand-ups, and there's no synchronousness there. You're just basically sending video messages to your other teammates. And something to also note is that by and large, you see the most common form of asynchronous communication with respect to a media type is chat. And we're starting to see a lot more innovation with respect to asynchronous audio and video, but we haven't really seen too many examples of audio and video based asynchronous communication come into the sort of forefront. But I'm really curious to see how that evolves over the next couple of years. Anyway, so really drilling into the advantages of asynchronous communication. The prime example is that you can respond to your message on your own timeline. So if you're in deep work and you want to really knock something out, just because somebody sends you an email or assigns you a ticket in Jira or responds it in a comment in Asana doesn't necessarily mean that you have to immediately respond right then and there. You can kind of triage that response to when it's appropriate. And one thing is that the next point is that it's time zone inclusive. Asynchronous conversations can happen over multiple different time zones, which is awesome. But the disadvantage is that it's a lower fidelity medium, right? So if I send a message to you and I have an expectation that it's going to be triaged at a later point, Doug, if I'm sending him asynchronous comms, could respond to that 5 hours later. But oftentimes that might mean I'm actually blocked on his tasks for the next 5 hours, right? So you either have to be incredibly explicit about how you specify tasks and structure, or you just sort of have to wait it out until they get back to you. So that can be the frustrating part. The lower fidelity medium can be a little bit challenging. Another thing, and it also comes back down to this lower fidelity medium, is that onboarding new employees is challenging. Whenever you onboard a new employee, right, new employee has like a ton of different questions. There's, they could have, 5 questions an hour. And if they're constantly asking questions asynchronously and you're responding to them when it's convenient for you, they're likely not going to be onboarded very quickly. And there's just the third element of that is that when you're coming down to decisions that need to be made, you kind of lose the human touch of it. And I think that's where a lot of these new age audio video asynchronous tools are trying to re-add that element of a human touch into a discussion. But that's still what's I personally feel is missing from a lot of asynchronous communication decision-making processes. So it's a little bit about asynchronous, but with respect to asynchronous v synchronous, the answer is really not very binary at all. Asynchronous tends to slow down your immediate progress because you have to write a lot more upfront or be a lot more deliberate about things upfront. But over time, it scales your knowledge, right? Like the idea is that when you're writing an asynchronous message, it's not going into the ether. You're actually storing it inside of this collective knowledge base that's more easily indexable and searchable, and eventually scales your knowledge and will also help you scale your team. And synchronous is, obviously fast for problem resolution. I can get unblocked very quickly, but doesn't necessarily scale your organization. Doesn't scale your knowledge and therefore might make it more challenging to scale up your team when you're trying to add more people on. There's actually a lot of interesting companies around how to turn synchronous communication into essentially like stored knowledge as an asynchronous force that can be actually collectively held. There's a company actually called OneBar, which is working on that. So I think it's an interesting space as well. I don't know how effective those tools are, but it might be something that's interesting to kind of, as a sort of stopback gap between synchronous and asynchronous to sort of try to blend both the best of both worlds. Okay, and one thing to also note with respect to this asynchronous v synchronous debate is that every company needs some combination of async v sync. I think it's easy to see the narratives on social media and say that, oh, asynchronous is the only thing that we need as a remote team. I simply just don't think that's true. I think, there is a valid argument with respect to having there be too much synchronous communication that introduces a lot of disruption, but at the end of the day, some blend of async and sync is always going to be important. So it's basically finding that ideal distribution between async and sync. And what I'm going to be talking about for the next, 45 minutes is that distribution really depends on the type of remote team that you have. And it really boils down to, one, how co-located is that remote team? And two, how much time zone overlap do you have with that team? So that's a little bit about the asynchronous v synchronous debate. So coming back to the different types of remote teams is a quick reminder. Number one, hybrid teams with only a couple remote workers. Two, hybrid teams with satellite offices. Three, fully remote teams with high time zone overlap. And four, fully remote teams with a low degree of time zone overlap. Okay, so let's really drill into this first one of hybrid teams with a couple remote. So inside of this setup, most people are co-located inside of an office with only a couple remote workers. And generally speaking, remote workers tend to be people who were formerly inside of a physical office, but had to move for a variety of reasons. Either they, their wife or husband got a job across the country, but they still wanted to maintain working with the same team. And of course, the main HQ wanted to retain them because they're excellent employees. So that's what we see as the most common sort of example that somebody would find of this sort of team structure. And with respect to traditional challenges that you might find in these sort of hybrid teams, number one is exclusion from conversations and decision making. And part of that comes from a feeling of there being a power imbalance between in-office workers and remote workers. So, the biggest thing is that when you're inside of a co-located office, the inclination is that it's so easy if you have 3 or 4 people who are on your team sitting right next to you to go over them, tap them on the shoulder, or engage with them in sort of like an actual physical synchronous conversation that's happening in real life. But the reality is the moment that you do that, there's exclusion from conversation because you're not actually including the remote worker in that conversation. So inherently over time, that power imbalance, there's just an asymmetry between how much people feel like they matter. So that's the first solution. And we have a couple different tactics for solving that. And the first one is to sort of always turn on your video during meetings. And it's super important to remember that the person on the receiving end of a video conference is actually, a person, first of all. And then you want to read all the sort of emotions that come associated with that person, right? Are they mad? Are they sad? Are they confused about something? It's really easy to tell whether somebody is experiencing those emotions if you can actually see their face. So we always recommend to teams to always turn on their video, and we always see that the teams that consider the most about how their remote workers are feeling always turn on their video, or are encouraged to. So one thing that's interesting about hybrid teams is that they tend to be very synchronous focused, just because a lot of in-office teams tend to be very synchronous. And even though I don't necessarily agree with that in all circumstances, it's important to note that as a remote worker, you just need to make sure that you're included in these conversations. So you need to match their style as much as possible. So it's very much about like, how do you feel included? How do you feel activated inside of this team? So typically, whether you push your asynchronous communication in your team inside of in-office setting, it's likely not going to work as effectively. So we really push people to try to use more synchronous communication while they're working remotely. Some other more specific tactics is a 360-degree camera, such as Owl. I haven't specifically used it, but I've heard a lot of good things about it. And basically, the purpose of a 360-degree camera like Owl is basically you set it in the middle of the conference table, and it'll take a picture of everybody inside of the table, and it'll intelligently move to whoever's speaking. So that's also something that could be interesting for a lot of office workers. And on top of that, one thing that we also recommend that's worked for a lot of different teams is the Brady Bunch view. And to kind of drill into that, the Brady Bunch view is typical with like, the Brady Bunch like view, you'll actually see different people in the same sort of equal amount of space. So the idea being that even people who are inside of the office will each take their own laptop and either work from a separate location, or they'll work inside of the, the same conference room, but everybody but one computer will mute themselves. And that's a way to sort of promote visual equality between everybody inside of the meeting, because it's really easy to feel like you're excluded if you have one view into a room with like 5 people in it, and you're the only remote worker who's not there. So we actually got that idea from Ian Tien, who's in Mattermost, and he actually really tries to push that for this team, and it's really worked well for him. Cool. And the next sort of team structure is a hybrid team with satellite offices. So in this structure, it's actually very similar in terms of its mechanics and how people communicate to number one, the hybrid team with a couple different people. But idea is that teammates are located across geographically distributed offices. And the reason why the office was built could be for a variety of reasons, whether to reduce cost, whether they wanted to have more boots on the ground in a new market. Let's say if I'm in San Francisco, I want to open up an office in Austin or New York City to sell there. It might be compelling to actually go there and then open a new office there, and or to recruit better or cheaper talent. Let's say you've sort of tapped out your ability to access talent inside of the Bay just because it's too cost prohibitive. Then you can just recruit better and cheaper talent, or like cheaper talent elsewhere. And yeah, so that's the third reason that you'd often find for another office. So the challenges associated with a hybrid team with a satellite office is very similar to number one. It's exclusions from conversation and decision making. It's a power imbalance, again, not between necessarily the in-office and remote. It's more about like the main HQ and the satellite offices. So oftentimes the people in the satellite offices won't feel as valuable or contributing to the team. So like, and one thing that's important is, and it's important to clear up, is that the inclination is to think that satellite workers won't feel as left out just because they might be surrounded by other members like of a different team. But the reality is that the satellite worker often does feel left out because they might be the only person who's part of that specific team in that particular area. So it's more about like whether the conversations and work that they're involved in are properly getting communicated to them from the main HQ. So it's very similar, but with a slight twist. And the problems and solutions are actually very similar. Always turn on your video. Try to match the style of the main HQ because it'll be very hard to shift them culturally away from using synchronous communication. 3, using 360-degree cameras such as OWL. People generally tend to recommend that a lot. And Brady Bunch view, again, for video conferencing, a lot of those work very well. But the reality is that, and one thing I really want to point out here is that hybrid situations are super tough, just in general. It's that feeling of power imbalance is something that's very, very hard to sort of break away from. We've seen certain attempts at it which have had mixed success of management trying to create new teams for new products and features in a fully distributed manner. But the issue with that turns out to be that when you're creating a new product feature or new product line, you're often gauging interest for that based on just interest in working in that product. And 2, whether people's timelines for working on that product line match up. So oftentimes those two won't be met by a team that's fully geographically distributed. So it's more based on demand. So we've seen some attempts at doing that with mixed success. So it's more just being mindful of being as remote friendly as possible when you enter into these hybrid situations. Okay, so the third one is where things also get a little bit more interesting, which is fully remote teams with a high degree of time zone overlap. So these are essentially fully remote teams with essentially no permanent office space. They might have a couple co-working spaces which are rented out, but there's no expectation that anybody actually goes into these offices, and a lot of times people won't actually. So and also in this type of structure, teammates are located within similar time zones to better collaborate synchronously. So an example of that is if I'm working the East Coast of US, like New York City, and working with people in Colombia or Mexico, or I'm in Singapore and working with people inside of Tokyo or Bangalore. And just to give you an example of what that time zone overlap could look like, with a typical 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. time zone overlap between New York and Bogota and Colombia would be 8 hours. So essentially losing no time there. Bogota to Mexico City, 7 hours, so you're losing an hour. Mexico City to New York, you're losing around an hour. So it's essentially a tremendous amount of overlap. An example too would be, if the Singapore, Japan, India example, Singapore to Tokyo is going to be around 7 hours. Tokyo to Bangalore is about to be 4.5 hours. Bangalore to Singapore is also 5.5 hours. So it's a decent amount of overlap in time to get stuff done synchronously should you need to. And some classic examples of fully distributed companies with a high degree of time zone overlap, like 1Password and Articulate. Granted, they also have people who exist outside of those time zones. And I'm sort of mostly basing this on this application that we built called Remote Mapper, which basically just looks at the geographical distribution of different teams across the globe. So it's just sort of basing it on that. So that's at a sort of company level, how, what is the density of those employees in a particular area. But of course, they have people that are outside of that and actually very non-overlapping time zones as well. So 1Password, Articulate tend to be a good example of that. On top of that, some of the challenges that you might experience with a fully remote team with high degree of overlap is that it's hard to build camaraderie with teammates. And something that came up over and over again with respect to our interviews with remote teams is how little impromptu audio video conversations were happening. So for a lot of the IC remote workers who we interviewed, many of them were only having one impromptu audio video conversation per week. And it's important to keep in mind that they were having many other sort of structured audio video conversations, whether it was a stand-up per day or a specific scheduled meeting to talk about something. But with respect to impromptu audio video conversations, it was only happening around on average once per week, which is crazy thinking about how often impromptu conversations happen inside of a physical office space, whether you're getting coffee near the water cooler, or you're grabbing lunch with one of your coworkers. So what we see over and over again is that people aren't necessarily building up those bonds with their teammates over time. So on top of that, another challenge is it's often difficult to organize and uncover important information. And as a result, work is often duplicated, right? So if your documentation about a certain type of code or project, or certain policies, just from an organizational perspective, that work is often duplicated because people just don't know that it exists. So we see that a lot. And three, there's often no sense of social signaling. So this is also something that a lot of offices take for granted, right? So if I look over at Doug and we're inside of an office, I can see that he has his headphones in. He seems to be super intense working on something that looks like it matters quite a lot. That's a social signal, right? I probably shouldn't disrupt him. And for another social signal would be like, if two of your coworkers are chatting around the water cooler and they're laughing about something, you can probably go and join them. They're probably not talking about something that's super serious. They're probably like bantering about some non-work topic or some work topic that's inclusive to other people inside of the office. So you kind of lose those social signals, which are really value additive in knowing whether somebody's available for a chat. And really drilling into that social signal case. Some examples of this, I covered some of them, is no indication of focus time. In office, people tend to wear headphones to do that. Two, there's no indication of impromptu sort of water cooler chats that might be fun to participate in. there's no indication of side conversations that might be relevant to you. If you're inside of an office and you're working at your desk and you hear somebody, talking about a part of the code base that you're familiar with, you might want to actually go over and chat with them. And there's like no lunchtime conversations and happy hours, and which might seem like a little bit silly, but those are the things that really add to bonding. And at least for me personally, I've actually, a lot of those lunchtime conversations have really evolved into fascinating conversations of how I can improve the product. And those have turned out to be really great for adding in culture and also making more creative product decisions. Cool. So some of the potential solutions for this sort of situation of remote worker is very similar. Like a lot of the same principles will hold from the first two as well. But so always turn on your video. If there is a small office space that tends to have a couple people in it, things like a Brady Bunch view or maybe even Owl. The Owl probably makes more sense for larger in-office areas. Might make sense. And generally speaking, communicating through asynchronous channels is really going to take off in this approach. Mostly to one, persist knowledge in a way so you don't have to redo the work, and two, also to make larger decisions. Because even though you may be in the same sort of high overlapping time zone, it's just easier to conduct these larger decisions, because like one or two people might not be able to make those larger synchronous conversations that happen over a meeting. So making those larger decisions over asynchronous channels, like Threads is a good example of that has worked well for a lot of teams, of just getting to a decision in a larger context. And something that people also take for granted is to not be afraid of using synchronous communication. And you should take advantage of the sort of time zone overlap that you have with other people to use synchronous, but you should create a policy around how you communicate synchronously with people so you don't introduce those disruptions into their flow. So for example, like an easy one is like, hey, I'm going to be deep working from this morning. I'm going to maybe even schedule focus time inside of my calendar. And hey, you can contact me between 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. When I'm working on random tasks synchronously if you want. So that's one element that you can do. Others more specific sort of tooling that you can use is, there's matchmaking Slack apps like Donut, which are really good for sort of, one, distributing knowledge amongst teammates who don't necessarily know each other very well, and two, also just getting and bonding together with other members of your team more. There's also Slack channels for banter and non-work context that's worked really well for a lot of teams. And one thing that a lot of HR people use is they'll organize like non-work related contests, like we're take a photo of your dog or cat that's hanging out with you while you're working remotely from your house, and there'll be a contest around that. Other things you can do are virtual icebreakers, whether it's trivia or QA about somebody's life. You'd always be fascinated to know, more about like your teammates. So that those things really open people up and allow channels of communication and bonding to happen where it didn't before. Virtual office hours, and I'll talk about this more in depth in just a second. And things like virtual happy hours have been really important for people as well. But something that's very important to highlight here is that consistency is key. Doing one happy hour here and there is always good. So it's better than none. But if people get into the habit of every Thursday at 5 p.m., they're always, everybody gets their beer and goes on to a vid chat. It's a good feeling, and it's a way to sort of open up discourse. But a little bit more about virtual office hours. And the reason why I also invite people to really think through their synchronous time a lot is that people actually tend to like synchronous a lot, but they don't like disruption. Nobody likes disruption, right? And virtual office hours is a good way of really promoting that sort of authentic, impromptu synchronous conversation without actually, taking too much time away from that person. So what we see a lot of teams doing is that from, every day from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m., I'm going to be available, whether it's in an open Zoom link or instead of a channel inside of Pragli. People tend to use that a lot. And some things where it really enables is distributing knowledge across more teammates. and also enhanced bonding sessions with no professional expectations. So essentially what that means is, you can just ask questions of your boss, like, like how, and about their career, or just any random question that you might have. And having those non-work related expectations really enhances culture as well. Cool. And getting to the last type of remote team, it's the fully remote with a low time zone overlap. So this is essentially a fully remote team, again, with no permanent office space, and teammates are located across vastly different time zones. So, from the US to Russia to India, US to Spain to China. So basically, and it's important here to know that when I talk about teams with low time zone overlap, I'm not making a one-to-one comparison from that team to a company. A lot of times you'll have companies that have, both. They'll have a lot of teams which are both, low and high time zone overlap teams, and and for that company, they'll have to, use these toolkits for both of those classes of teams, because they both present different types of challenges. So yeah, it's more helpful to think about the core unit of structure as being the team rather than the company. But anyway, so really understanding and why this could be an issue too is, with the time zone overlap, San Francisco to St. Petersburg, I guess it's 0 hours. San Francisco to Bangalore, definitely 0 hours with respect to 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. time zone overlap. Bangalore to India, I think it's around 5.5. And then, example of New York to Madrid would be 2 hours. New York to Shanghai would be 0 hours. Madrid to Shanghai would be around an hour. So those are examples of low time zone overlap teams. So with respect to the challenges, they're very similar to the challenges that you experience with a fully remote team with high degree of time zone overlap, but more intensified. There tends to be more confusion around when discussions are happening. And also, with respect to, since there's a lot more asynchronous communication, there needs to be more of a thought through process for how people are taking notes and communicating those notes to the rest of the team. There often tends to be frustration about when meetings are scheduled. And whether it's very late or too early. Often how you see that manifest is as a power imbalance. So whoever has, let's say if a team of 5, one person's in India, 4 in the US, the inclination is always going to be to run meetings at 8 a.m. or even 9 a.m. In the US. And it's always going to be late in the day for the person in India. And especially if that person is not a manager and it's a IC, it can be kind of scary to push back on that and actually say, hey, is there a way to more equitably distribute this? It doesn't have to be every single time 9 a.m. So there's a lot of frustration around that. So kind of tactics to deal with that are, in the case of low time zone overlap, you absolutely have to communicate asynchronously. There's no way you can get around it. And actually what we see that's interesting is that a lot of people use Slack asynchronously, and they'll develop rules around it. They'll say, hey, there's no expectation that you respond to DMs. There's no expectation that you have to respond to @messages immediately. You can silence all notifications if you want, and you almost treat it like an email inbox. And your inbox is determined by the sort of active notifications that you've received on your sidebar. And on top of that, in addition to just communicating more asynchronously using task management systems like Jira and Asana, or using Slack asynchronously, one thing that we recommend too is that to combat against that frustration of meetings being done only with respect to one time zone that's friendliest for the kind of majority of people around that team. I would really recommend round robining between convenient times, given that there's 0 time zone overlap between geographies. So, in India to US, maybe every 3rd time or 4th time, the people in the US, if they're the majority, do it at 9 p.m. And so it's easier for the person who's in India where it's 9:30 a.m. So that's just a good cultural thing that, hey, we're thinking about you. We want you to feel included, right? And that small little thing can go a long way. And then on top of that, One thing that's also small but also pretty tactical is also to standardize all documents on GMT. I've gotten confused plenty of times where people put in times that are local for them, and then it just kind of messes with everybody's mind. So standardizing on GMT always helps with that. So, and I've seen, especially in companies like Elastic, where they'll almost put it inside of the header for every email. Like which time that a particular email was sent at. So everybody's on the same page. And it's easier to reason about timing. Again, and this is going to be a little bit harder. Don't be afraid of synchronous. If you need to use synchronous, you should do it, but you got to develop rules around it. And it's important to be upfront about those rules. Virtual office hours is a great way to do that. And what's also important is that once you develop your rules, that's not where it stops. You got to keep iterating on the rules because, people get very overwhelmed if they have too much too much synchronous, and they feel like they're getting disrupted too often. So definitely iterate on the rules. Have a culture of saying, hey, is this too much? Is this too little? Because of course, too much, especially since there's zero overlap in time. If you receive a synchronous message from a person in India and it's 9 p.m. and you're responding to too many of those messages, it can lead to burnout. And it's also just not efficient. So developing rules around that is super important. And with respect to managing time zones, one that a lot of people like is timezone.io. It just helps for scheduling and availability as a sort of visual way to see where people are. So that's an example of something that people like a lot. I've heard of one called Spacetime as well, so you might also consider that. But yeah, there's a ton of these time zone tracking tools, and I would just play around with each one of them, see which works for you. But the important is a quick way to see who's online and how much time you have left with them before their day ends. Cool. And also, this is the same sort of tactical list as I was showing in number 3, but it's going to be much harder to do given that you're across time zones. So things like Donut, Slack channels for banter, virtual icebreakers, virtual office hours, virtual happy hours, all those are super important. But make a best effort about it. But it's going to be way harder to sort of schedule those things when you're working with a low time zone environment. But try to make a best effort. Try to but if you do it too often, and especially if it's in a particular teammate's non-friendly time zone time, it can lead to some frustration. So make a best effort, but don't worry too much if it doesn't work out. And I guess the rub, after kind of discussing all 4 of these, is what is my sort of preference with respect to these 4 different types of teams. Generally speaking, and this is just my preference, is that I love fully remote teams with a high degree of time zone overlap. That doesn't mean that you're always going to use synchronous communication. You develop policies for async, and wherever you can, wherever you think that knowledge is going to be could potentially be duplicated, you create docs for it, and then could push it into the collective knowledge. But what's good about high degrees of overlap is that if you have a customer bug, for example, or there's some customer fire, I have a high degree of confidence I'm going to be able to synchronously contact somebody and get to a resolution very fast. So that higher fidelity, if I really need to, is very important. And third, but very important, is that it's easier to build camaraderie with synchronous systems. It's easier to build banter and develop genuine bonds with your coworkers if you're able to synchronously communicate with them. And the caveat being with all of this is that it's harder to globally expand. Once you develop policies and procedures that are very designed around a high time zone overlap that might have a high degree of synchronous, and then you introduce somebody who's outside of that time zone, it'll be very tough for them to kind of acclimate into that structure. So it's harder to expand globally, given that global expansion will capture somebody outside of that time zone. And you're also kind of precluding yourself from a larger talent pool. If you're in the U.S., you won't be able to access the excellent engineers in Russia or India or China. So that's kind of the trade-off that you have to make. And then also a quick note about this as well is that a lot of these tactics need manager buy-in. Super important. And because even if you say it to your teammates and say, hey, like, can we do virtual office hours? Can we do virtual happy hours? Things like that. You need to develop a team habit around it. So it's really important to communicate with your manager and say, hey, are you okay with this protocol, first of all, and make a compelling case to them. And two, have them try to continually remind the team of what that protocol is and what we agreed to, and the motivation for that. So buying in a manager is super, super important. So I'd almost say, you know, schedule one-on-one times to make a compelling case for them. Cool. So, you know, that's it for me. You know, first of all, I'd like to thank Ksenia and Dennis for having me. I really appreciate it. And yeah, and if there's any questions, you know, anybody can ask questions.